All right, welcome everyone to today's Batten Chat. My name is John Holbein. I'm an assistant professor of public policy, politics, and education at the Frank Batten School of Leadership and Public Policy. Today's chat is going to be focused on the implications of youth turnout for 2020 and also a more general discussion of youth voter turnout in the United States historically and approaches that we can take for increasing youth turnout. So the way this chat is going to work today is I'm going to share a few prepared remarks for you. I have a few slides with images and a few figures to show you, to give you context for our discussion. That'll be about 10 minutes of this presentation. Then for the rest of the time, the rest of the 20 minutes after that, we'll do Q&A. So we encourage you to use the Q&A function in the Zoom portal. So with that, I will go ahead and start sharing my screen. All right, so as I mentioned, to give you a bit of context for thinking about youth voter turnout in the 2020 election amidst the somewhat unique circumstances that we're facing with the global pandemic, I think it's useful to think about what we know in general about youth voter participation in the United States. And a lot of what I'll be saying today is drawn from my book that just came out about a month ago, Making Young Voters, Converting Civic Attitudes into Civic Action. It's co-authored with Sunshine Hillygus of Duke University, wherein we explore patterns of youth voter participation in the United States historically. We look for reasons why young people don't show up as much as older citizens. And we think about policies and reforms that can help to increase the youth vote. So to give you a bit of context, many of you might be familiar with a chart that looks something like this. This is rates of voter participation in presidential and midterm elections. That's why the graph, the lines tend to go up and down given higher rates of voter participation in presidential elections as opposed to midterms. And then it's broken by two different age groups. On the top, individuals who are 60 years and above, and on the bottom, individuals who are 18 to 29. It doesn't really matter if you change this from 18 to 29 to 18 to 25. Regardless of how you look at it, young people are much less likely to vote than elder citizens. And as you can see with the dark black line here, there's a large gap that has been persistent for decades, for the past 3 decades. In fact, even if we went back further than this graph shows to the 1972 election when 18-year-olds were first given the right to vote, the gap was large and has been large since then. Interestingly, if you look in 2018, when there was a lot of talk about youth turnout increasing, you can see that there was an uptick from 2014 to 2018 in terms of youth turnout, a fairly significant growth or increase of youth turnout, but the gap between older and younger voters stayed virtually the same. So still a full 7 in 10 young people did not cast a ballot in 2018. To give you a bit of context for where this benchmarks relative to other countries, this figure shows that same gap. So remember that black line from the last slide, the gap between older and younger voters in terms of the rates of voter participation. And this is across several advanced democracies, about 30 or so in the world. And on the left-hand side are countries that have the smallest gap between older and younger voters, the few exceptions where younger voters vote at a rate slightly higher than older voters tend to have compulsory voting or kind of strange systems. In most countries, it is the case that older voters vote at a rate higher than younger voters. But in the United States is all the way on the far right-hand side, the shaded bar, as you can see. This shows that the United States has uniquely low rates of youth voter participation. It's not just that we are like everywhere else, but the United States system produces young voters who are especially bad at turning out at the polls. So in the book, we talk about why young people don't vote as much as we'd like them to in the United States. So to give you a bit of context, previous research on patterns of youth voter participation has suggested that young people don't turn out to vote because they're disinterested in politics, that they just don't care, that they're apathetic, that they're sort of disengaged, disinterested in politics. And the implication for this view of young people is that in order to increase their levels of voter participation, we need to make politics more interesting. We need to target political interest and political motivation. We need to get young people oriented towards participating in politics. And this approach has been used for a long time by various organizations such as Rock the Vote, who have sunk millions and millions of dollars into trying to make voting cool, make it interesting, to get young people interested and engaged in politics. And while they've done a lot of good work, there's some reasons to think that this approach is actually a bit misguided. So if we look in survey data at young people's levels of political interest over time, as this figure is showing, young people's levels of political interest are high and rising, almost to the point where our current measures of political interest can't, are sort of like, we're capping them out, right? So in 2016, for example, a full 9 in 10 young people said that they intended to vote, right? One barometer of how oriented or how interested, how much they are sort of wanting to participate in politics. A full 8 in 10 said that they were interested in elections. This doesn't matter if you use different measures like, do you care who is the president, or do you follow elections, or various other measures of political interest. Young people are very, very interested in politics, and this has been especially true recently. The problem is that they're still not turning out. So it's not for a lack of political motivation. They have political motivation, they're just not showing up at the ballot box. So in the book, we talk about this gap between interests, sort of intention, and behavior, right? So for young people, the challenge is less that they're disinterested, and it's more that they really struggle to follow through given their interest that they have. They're about twice as unlikely to follow through as older citizens. Okay, so why do young people struggle to follow through? So to sort of supplement the quantitative aspect of our book, we did interviews with young people around the country. And we asked them questions, open-ended questions, why they did or did not turn out to vote. And sort of pulling out from those surveys or those qualitative interviews were a couple of lessons that we learned. So the first is that many young people lack confidence in their ability to engage in politics. And they feel like they need to know more about politics than they actually maybe need to know. This gap is not as big for older people. So older people are sort of willing to participate with lower levels of political knowledge than young people, right? And so there's a quote there. I won't spend the time to read it all, but we heard this again and again, that young people lack confidence in their ability to participate in politics. The second thing that we heard from young people again and again was that they found the registration and voting process intimidating and confusing. They were worried that they would make errors on voter registration forms, and many young people do make errors on voter registration forms. There was a recent study that suggested about half of young people, as many as half of young people, make a mistake on voter registration forms, such as not signing their voter registration form, not putting in their social security number, making the types of mistakes that will kick a voter registration form back to the citizen. So they make many, many errors, and they find the whole process confusing about when, where, and how they can register and vote. And then finally, they get distracted. Many of at a young age, life is sort of tumultuous. And many young people struggle to sort of manage their busy lifestyles and fit voting into that context. Okay, so what can we do to try and change these patterns of low rates of voter participation? In the book, we talk about things that schools can do, so education policy type reforms. I can talk about that in the Q&A, but I'm going to focus on the types of reforms that election laws, folks who are looking at election laws can implement to increase youth voter participation. So we have a number of reforms that we talk about in the book that show promising ability to increase youth voter participation. So among them are reforms that allow young people to pre-register when they're 16 or 17, such that they'll be automatically enrolled once they turn 18, if they choose to pre-register. Same-day registration, which allows young people to show up at the polls whenever they show up to register, instead of having to only be able to register, say, 30 days in advance of an election. Online registration, allowing young people and voters more generally to download or submit a voter registration form online. Automatic voter registration has always been in the in the news lately. It works. At least the preliminary evidence suggests that it's actually especially effective for young people who are coming into the electorate for the first time. And then finally, voter registration drives, not as much election law type of reform that often happens in schools, but these types of voter registration drives actually have a fairly sizable impact. So I wanted to mention one study that we talk about in the book that talks about the a specific program called the First Time Voter Program. The First Time Voter Program involved taking voting booths into classrooms in high schools around the country and teaching young citizens what a ballot looks like, helping them to go through the process of what a voting booth experience would look like, and encourage them to register to vote. This program took all of 45 minutes, one demonstration, so fairly, not very intensive, but had a fairly large impact on the chances that young people turned out and voted in an upcoming election, increasing rates of voter participation by a full almost 6 percentage points, which is a fairly sizable impact. So where does this all leave us in the midst of a global pandemic and sort of a chaotic set of primary elections, or primarily in Wisconsin, what we've seen in Wisconsin? Where does it leave us heading into the 2020 elections in terms of youth voter participation? There are a couple of things that I think we should take away from the context that we've seen and what we know generally about youth voter participation. So the first thing is that given that young people are often very confused about voter registration rules, rules that govern how, when, and where they can actually cast their ballot, it's important for us to make it as easy as possible, but then to not go back and forth too close to the election. Doing so will only foster confusion, right? So I'm not arguing that we definitely should make voting easier, but as quick as we can do that it's really important, right? The sooner the better. We're almost a little bit behind on that dimension. So hopefully some of these court cases that we could talk about, trying to get vote by mail and other reforms in place will come to resolution soon, and those won't, maybe I'm being too optimistic that would happen. The second is that we can and should push for vote by mail. The research suggests that this is good for, at minimum, stabilizing levels of voter participation among young people, keeping it the same as it would be in in-person elections, or maybe even increasing rates of voter participation among young people. And then finally, regardless of how voting looks in the 2020 general elections, young people need to clear this hurdle of voter registration. Many of them don't. The gap in voter registration between older and younger citizens is very large, and plays a key role in driving the voter turnout rate between older and younger citizens. And regardless of how the voting looks in 2020, young citizens are going to have to register in basically all states. So we should be holding voter registration drives now. Unfortunately, we're sort of behind on this end as well. Many public schools, or some public schools, I'll say, do voter registration drives for students, say in the lunchroom, at the table, or in the classroom. I don't think that's happening as much, given that many schools are canceled or doing online learning on the fly. So we need to think about very carefully how we can sort of replace or try and do the best that we can to get young people registered, given that many of the kind of sparse but important voter registration drives that are happening appear to be not happening during the pandemic. Okay, with that, I will stop sharing my screen, and I am more than happy to share my thoughts to any questions that you have. Aaron has been one of our, who's helping us with this presentation, has been kind enough to put the title of my book and a link to it in the chat. But we just encourage you to ask any questions that you might have about youth turnout generally, or about the 2020 election specifically now. And there should be a box at the bottom. If you're not familiar, if you haven't done a webinar on Zoom before, you can click the Q&A box at the bottom. You should see some notifications there on your screen. Feel free to type any questions you have there.
John, it looks like we do have a couple questions using Q&A.
Oh, great. Yeah, sorry, I just missed that. I'm new to this as well.
No problem. Sure, I'll kick off the first question for you. We have a question from an anonymous attendee. Thank you for sharing your expertise, Professor Holbein. What can schools do to help encourage youth voting?
Yeah, thanks, whoever posted this question. So several things. So the first is just mechanical. Hold voter registration drives as much as possible. Help young people overcome this barrier that stops many of them from showing up at the ballot box. We've seen that this is effective, an effective way for helping young people vote. A couple other things that schools can do to be more immersive are to focus on active learning. Instead of just teaching young people knowledge and facts about the Constitution and politicians from 200 years ago. They can focus on contemporary issues. They can focus on getting young people involved in their communities and helping them to participate even if they're pre-voting age. So a couple of examples. So many democracy prep charter schools. I don't know if many of you are familiar with them, but this is a model for infusing a school system with opportunities to interact with the political system throughout the school day. So in democracy prep charter schools, students engage in a social action project during the semester where they go to their local communities and engage in making plans, contacting public officials, working with nonprofits to try and solve local problems on the local level. They also encourage young citizens to help other citizens who are voting age to register to vote, and they canvass to get them out to vote. And they also do things like meet with elected officials. So it's very important for schools to do these types of active learning, wherein they teach young people the skills and knowledge that they need to be actively participating in democracy. And what we see is when they don't do this, when they just focus on sort of the classic civics approach, which is like teaching to the test, helping encouraging students to memorize facts about basically a history class, that doesn't work. So now that I see where these questions are, it looks like we have another question. Does our research focus at all, this is from Jay, does our research focus at all on the role of K through 12 education in this phenomena? Yeah, definitely. So in the book, we talk about how it really is, it's not enough to leave voter registration and talking about voting, preparing young people for voting to universities. So universities have some unique requirements and opportunities to register young citizens, to teach them the skills and the knowledge they need to be active participants. But in some respects, we want to do it earlier, right? Everything we know about human development would suggest that if we teach young people these skills and knowledge earlier on, we'll have the chance to have a larger impact. So yeah, so the K through 12 landscape as it stands currently is not, it could be better, and there are various reasons for that. In the book, we definitely do not cast blame exclusively on teachers or on school administrators, but I think they're facing a unique set of challenges currently that pushes them towards focusing on sort of rote memorization that's less effective at increasing youth voter participation. So we have another question from an anonymous attendee. What would you expect to be the relationship between youth voting and vote by mail or other voting options? Yeah, so it's, at worst, it keeps vote by mail keeps youth voter participation at the same levels it would be otherwise in person, right? So at worst, if we do vote by mail in 2020, we would expect to see youth rates of voter participation be where they have been historically. At best, however, some studies show, for example, there's a study a couple years back by Seth Hill and a few other co-authors looking at Washington's rollout of vote by mail. And what they found was that in Washington, vote by mail increased youth voter participation more than it did increased older citizens' rates of voter participation. So it helped narrow the gap between younger and older voters' rates of political participation. So it works, right? So it either keeps it, depending on what your framework is. I think in the midst of a pandemic, keeping rates of voter participation similar to what they've been in the past is actually a victory, right? And if we increase rates of youth voter participation, that's even more so. Okay, so we have another question from an anonymous attendee. So did the draft selective service change youth voting rates around the Vietnam War? Yeah, so there's, I think it's a paper by Bob Erickson, and I can't remember who Bob's co-author was, that suggests that selective service did, so sort of using the lottery or the sort of kind of random nature of the draft, found that it did, right? So selective service did. I'm actually working on some separate research right now that's looking at a similar question as to whether or not various public service, national service programs increase rates of youth voter participation. So to do this, we're using the Teach for America program as a case study. What we find is that participating in Teach for America has a large impact on whether or not young people vote. So I think some national service, public service type stuff definitely has the potential to help remediate low rates of youth participation. Okay, another question from an anonymous attendee. Everyone's wanting to stay anonymous with their questions. Thank you for them, even though I don't know who's sending these in. So how do concerns about foreign interference with elections affect youth voting opinions and rates? This is a really great question. I'm gonna do what I think we should do more in science research and say, I don't know. I could speculate that given that young people seem to be more sensitive overall to uncertainty, that they would disproportionately affect young people, but we don't have a really good study, or to my knowledge, actually any systematic empirical study at the moment on this question, but it's a great one. Okay, another one from an anonymous attendee. We're interested to see if you looked at support for ranked choice voting and if younger voters seem to support it more or less relative to other voting blocks. And if so, do you think it could increase youth voter turnout? Yeah, maybe. It's possible that this could have an impact. I think it would be a modest impact on turnout. Simply because what our research suggested was that youth voter participation doesn't appear to be low because young people are sort of like overwhelmingly dissatisfied with the current choices that they have at their disposal. Now that's different from saying, you know, I'd like to be able to rank order my choices and have that be weighted by an algorithm and determine who the ultimate winner is. But it is not the case that, I would say it's kind of the case that young people are a little bit dissatisfied with the types of candidates that are running. However, there's not a lot of evidence to suggest that, that it's sort of systematic dissatisfaction with the system and how voting is working. I think ranked choice voting has other attractive properties in terms of aggregating votes that are cast in a way that's more desirable. But I'm not sure that it would increase voter participation. There hasn't been really great research in this area yet. Another question from an anonymous attendee. President Trump has frequently argued that vote by mail would advantage Democrats in the 2020 election. What does research show on this point? Does vote by mail really advantage Democrats? This is a great question. So the answer is no, it doesn't advantage Democrats. So another project that I'm working on right now is looking at the effects of vote by mail historically as local municipalities have implemented vote by mail over time, looking at whether or not that shifts elections towards Democrats or not. And it doesn't, right? And it's very clear that it doesn't. Vote by mail, when it's implemented, increases voter turnout and makes it more representative in terms of bringing in more young voters. However, it doesn't advantage Democrats. So claims to the contrary are just wrong. Vote by mail, as best we can tell, has an equal impact on the chances that a Republican or Democrat wins. Another question from an anonymous attendee. What can schools and professors do to help the hundreds of millions of dollars for election administration in the newly passed CARES Act spent in ways that encourage youth voting? Yeah, so this is a great question. Lots of interesting ways to go with this. I think it's really important for professors to talk about, professors and K through 12 instructors as well, to talk about contemporary political issues, to spend time in class to encourage students to register to vote, to bring in elected officials to allow students to interact with public officials and engage with them, to start programs that have young people trying to solve various social problems in their community. These types of things that focus on applied learning are the direction that we want to go. Sorry, that was a quicker response, but I want to get through as many of these as we can. Politically, why has the US not implemented universal automatic voter registration at 18? This is a good question. So there are bureaucratic challenges to doing automatic voter registration. It's challenging it's a challenging administrative process to handle data across various public units, the DMV, various public service, maybe schools, but those aren't insurmountable challenges, and we've seen places like Oregon, Utah, Colorado navigate this portion of it fairly successfully. So I don't think it's actually the cost in terms of like how long and how much effort it takes to administer automatic voter registration. I think it has something to do with perception, again, that this type of reform would advantage one political party, namely the Democrats, over the Republicans. We don't have great evidence that that's the case yet. One of the challenging things about studying automatic voter registration is we just need more elections where we have had automatic voter registration, so it's a fairly new phenomena. We're pushing forward in that area. The early research suggests that AVR does increase voter participation, especially among young people. But I think the gap here is whether or not it advantages one political party over the other. I would not suspect that it does advantage the Democrats as much, at least in as much as some might argue. Is there evidence that the type of candidates available makes a difference? Some. Yeah, so I mean, there are very clearly differences in the 2020 election in terms of where young people were casting their ballots, overwhelmingly for Bernie as opposed to Joe Biden. It's hard to know, however, like the causal effect of that. Like we don't have really good natural experiments that sort of like test various types of candidates running for office. So I would say we don't have great evidence on this at present. However, I would say that the research that we do have suggests that even despite sort of general dissatisfaction that's maybe not as high as you might think, but it is there. Even in spite of general dissatisfaction, young people do overwhelmingly say that they want to vote, right? So the 9 out of 10 number that I showed you earlier is, I think, important here, right? A dominant majority of young people want to vote, even in the current system where they might be slightly dissatisfied with who's running for office. They still want to be a part of it, and maybe that would be enhanced if they had candidates that were more representative of their opinions. I guess we'll take one more question, given that it is 12:30 now. So this question comes from an anonymous attendee. So you mentioned that given that much of the literature points to a lack of engagement, a political implication would be to increase engagement, but this doesn't seem to be the problem. How common are interventions intended to address the problem directly? Addressing lack of engagement by increasing voting ineffective. Yeah, so I think this is important to sort of think about the problem carefully. So what do we mean when we say low youth engagement? So it's definitely the case that young people are less likely to vote, but they are very engaged sort of like psychologically, right? Like they want to be a part of the process. but they just don't, right? So I think it's important for us to think about interventions that focus on the follow-through piece of it. Young people definitely have the capacity to engage. We've seen it in protest-led movements in recent years, recent months, over climate change, gun control, and other issues. They definitely have the desire to engage. It's just about actually executing that, giving them the skills they need to follow through on their good intentions. So I know there are a couple of other questions that were left over. I'm more than happy to engage. You can feel free to email me. My email address is Holbein, Holbein @virginia.edu. I love talking about these topics related to youth voter participation and be happy to talk offline with you. But with that, given that we've reached our time limit, we will go ahead and sign off for now. Thank you everyone for attending this Batten Chat.